So, what is next for the world of employer branding? I had a great conversation with Nick Homer, and Nick has been in various employer branding roles in agencies and in house, and he's working in employer branding at Chapter 2 at the moment. It's always great to take a step back to look at what's coming up next in employer branding to make sure we all stay as relevant as and impactful as possible. So, let's get on with the chat.
Nick, how you doing?
I'm really good, thank you, Chris. How are you?
Good, thanks. Yeah, looking forward to the chat. Before we get on with that, let's just do a little bit of intro about yourself.
Hi, Chris. It's great to be here. My name is Nick Homer. I am the managing partner for employer brand at Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is in effect a talent business. We have an embedded talent solution, we have a talent intelligence solution, and we have an employer brand solution, which is where I come into things. Before my time here, previously global head of employer brand at Bumble and at Wayfair as well. And then I've also spent some time on the other side of the fence working in different specialist employer brand marketing agencies, the likes of 33, Tonic, Blackbridge, and so on.
Yeah, nice. I do like that nice balance between in-house and agency. I think it definitely gives. Well, it's no wonder we have a good chat, 'cause I think you've got really nice kind of balanced perspective on things. So let's get straight into it. Instead of this being let's just do like stargazing or future gazing into employer brand. I think I've got a few things I'd like to talk about. I think, when you look at employer branding right now, what is outdated, or dare I say it, broken in your mind?
Well, I famously wrote a post about employer brand being broken. And how really employer brand is all about reputation, which gathered quite a lot of commentary. I think for me, there's a couple of things. I think the first is that there's something about what average employer brand looks like, and maybe this sort of over reliance on perceived authenticity. There's something around that, and I think the second point here really is about actually the reputation of employer branding itself as a concept. And the reason why I say that is there's an industry that's never really enjoyed world-class budgets. But the amount of investment that it gets is really significantly underweight for the impact that it can have on a business.
Massively.
And as we sort of like reach a point, and particularly now, it's been possible to get through this conversation without talking about AI, but the ability of anybody to create employer brand content now is extremely high, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But where it does start to become a problem is where it becomes the same and where it becomes repetitive, and actually where the skill of helping an organization understand its point of differentiation starts to become lost. And I think when I talked about employer brand being broken, and this is like the first track, one of my points there really was about, you can have the greatest content, you can have the nicest career site, you can have a great hero film, social media strategy, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. But one of the problems, and this is something I picked up, particularly working in house, if your Glassdoor score is not very good, you're going to start to run into trouble sooner rather than later. Sometimes the question can often be, how can we use our employer brand to get over the fact we've got a poor Glassdoor score? Rather than, if we've got a poor Glassdoor score, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to fix it? And I gave a couple of examples from the consumer world about when things go wrong. Sometimes people need to, or sometimes organizations in particular, need to take accountability for that. And the greatest example of that, of course, is when KFC ran out of chicken. And they ran a series of ads nationwide where just rearranged the KFC letters to FCK. And it was like, actually, do you know what? We made a mistake here, and we're really sorry, but this is what we're going to do about it. And I think if you think about what I would call like the formula of employer brand, which should really, really simply be, if you've got a great employer brand, you've got an EVP that really translates your business for whatever audience you're talking to. It helps you attract the right talent. It actually helps the wrong talent deselect themselves in the process. But people should come in. What they experience should be what they're expecting, because you've done a really good job of telling the story. And then they stay, they perform well. If they perform well, the business succeeds. If you're simply using employer brand, EVP, etc., to attract people in, yet you know there's a problem further down the chain, then you're actually not solving the problem. You're simply just trying to fill a bucket that's got a hole in it with water a bit more quickly.
Probably making it worse as well, actually, by compounding the impact of having the wrong people in, them leaving soon after joining, or even maybe even worse, staying and not doing a good job.
Yeah, which would be, nobody wants either of those things. And, part of it's a bit like, if you ran a restaurant, and you had a set of reviews that said the food's not very good, then you'd investigate it and you'd do something about it. You might change your food supplier, you might change the menu, you might even need to change the chef, but you would take active, you would do something kind of like proactive to try and fix the problem and do that. And that will then obviously, you want to see the effect. People come to us and go, actually, do you know what? The food's really good now. Thank God, because the service was brilliant before, but we couldn't stand the burgers or whatever. And I think, I do think employers need to take the same approach towards their reputation as an organization as they would do with their reputation that they have with the consumers that they serve.
So actually, if we're talking about then employer branding in the context of reputation, what is it that organizations need to do to ensure that they are doing employer branding in the right way, in the contemporary modern day way?
I think good employer branding always comes back to, I think, probably like the same core principles that have always existed, which are around A, understanding your audience, B, understanding your own proposition, and actually like, what are we offering? How is it different to what our competitors offer? And sometimes that's only, I'm going to say degrees of separation. Sometimes I think it's almost degrees of separation, really. But then also understanding where that message is going to, where is that message going to appear? And so that well, this is who we're talking to, this is what we want to say, and this is how we're going to get it in front of them. Which is the same for, almost like any marketing activity. You've got to be clear on what you're trying to say, who you're trying to say it to, and what you want them to do with it. When they hear it. And employer brands do an incredibly powerful job of bringing that message to life. I think there's there is a sub role somewhere in there for employer brand to not just talk about the good stuff, but sometimes actually to talk about the bad stuff as well.
Yeah, nice. And look, this thing around authenticity, I think, I remember posting something about recently, a few weeks ago, about if you try and corporate authenticity, then it's not authentic. But why do organizations fall into that trap?
There have been a few articles about this, written around authenticity, and I think also the kind of the overuse of the word authentic, and because it's sort of become a byword for, this is real. And it's like, well, we can tell if a film's been scripted or not. We can do that, mostly because most employees are not very good actors. So the moment that they're kind of reading from a script, it all starts to go horribly wrong. The piece with authenticity, though, is this thing that I've kept, well, if we say this is authentic, then it must be real. And the labeling of that in itself, I actually think creates this illusion that it might not be. Like, why do we need to say that it's authentic? Because we should perceive it to, we want to actually perceive it to be real. And I think the other side of it as well is actually sometimes what's real at work is really boring. And I think, and I remember from my agency days, being in some various situations, like, you've got to come and we need to come and film this team. It's like, oh, great, what do they do? And so the technology team, and they're the team that's moving the business forward. And the reality was that it was half a dozen people sat around desks in an office and yes, of course, under there was a story to tell, but actually showing people sat around desks in the office is not different to the next company, to the company, a competitor. And I think this is where the storytelling aspects come through. This is where they actually kind of like, but what are they doing and what's the impact of it? And, kind of the real kind of like the show rather than tell makes a difference. Because I think, unfortunately, unless you are filming people taking helicopters to oil rigs, or jumping out of aeroplanes in His Majesty, as it is now, name, actually what most people do at work each day looks pretty dull to the outsider.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that for me is like, there is so much over the years and in our careers, and I think about my careers, is this addiction to selling the organization, which is, it's got to be something that could be an ad on TV, or it could be in the cinema. And all of a sudden the mode goes into, well, look, we need to understand what our audiences want, and then we understand where our strengths lie, and then we just pitch the hell out of it through promotional content. And I think, albeit I'm simplifying it, I think a lot of content in the employer branding world could sit under that addiction to promotion. And I think when that happens, it's got to be, it's got to be out and about. It's got to be in the coolest offices. It's got to look good. But actually, it's the content is the conversation. The content is their opinions and expertise and knowledge and the help that they can give. That's really, I suppose, for me, that's why your post about reputation really resonated with me, because my feeling is that being authentic is really actually about bringing that to life rather than just trying to do a showpiece thing and going, oh, if we haven't got a cool office, then we can't do anything because it doesn't look good. Well, actually, it's what we call them talent after all. Let's treat them like talent. Let's help show their talents. But I don't think we do that as much as we should be in the industry.
No, there can be a danger, and I say appreciation of sometimes there is a requirement to do something, but there is a danger, I think, producing content for the sake of producing content. And also this idea, as I was quoting, I think it's Arsene Wenger here, but everyone thinks they've got the most, I think he said everyone thinks they've got the most beautiful wife, but you can substitute wife for kids or dog.
Yeah.
And that piece of, well, the thing that is most important to somebody for them is the best. Totally understand that. Unfortunately, when you then project it externally to people who don't have that same emotional connection, it can fall a bit flat. It's a bit like showing photos of your family at turned up at the Rad Awards and started showing photos of family. It's great for a couple of minutes. Hey Nick, how you doing? I like here the kids, dogs. Oh, lovely. We get into, and here we are on holiday. Yeah. So you'll probably make your excuses and leave. So, but if there's then a story behind that, if there's that context, like a music anecdote or something, then there becomes much more interesting. And I think it's with employer brand content, sometimes you can fall into that trap of, we've got this thing that we think is really interesting to tell everybody, but actually it's the same as what everybody else says. But there was a real trend, which to a point probably still exists, although not like it did. But certainly pre-COVID, where every organization that you spoke to was a tech company. we're not a delivery company, we're a tech company. We're not a professional services firm, we're a tech company. But it's like, but actually, you need to be a tech company in order to be relevant at that particular point in time. In fact, not being a tech company would be a concern, because that would mean you're not using the latest tools, you're not thinking ahead. It's probably going to come back round again in the form of, we're not a delivery company, we're an AI company.
Yes.
You can see that trend probably coming somewhere over the horizon. But it's then, the real question in there, of course, was a real challenge in there would have been, we need to hire software engineers, and we can't get software engineers to come and work for this delivery company because we're not a tech in terms of being a FANG, or MANG, I suppose it is now, the Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, etc. But that, of course, is where employer brand does play a part. So, but there must be something exciting here that if you work in software engineering that you're building, and it's going to revolutionize the company or the industry, and things threads that you can pull on, that would be beyond simply, we're a tech company. Because actually the answer that you would then get back is, really? You sure?
Then I chat around reputation. Just saying employer branding really is about reputation. It's not about trying to be authentic. It's about fixing the things, the experiences and the organization inside, rather than just trying to put a marketing sheen on it. What do employer branding teams need to do to do what you're talking about?
It's a really good question. I think, like you, Chris, we both grew up in an industry, I think, where even if internal employer brand teams existed, but probably more talent acquisition teams would come to agencies to do employer brand work, because agencies had the combination of the know-how and the experience to be able to deliver, whatever the output was. All right, let's be realistic. Sometimes that was a court page advert in the Daily Telegraph, and we all got really excited about it because your mum and dad were going to see it in the paper. Not. I think what's sort of happened is you've had this transition now, which is still going on, where more and more organizations have employer brand teams in-house. And I'm sort of quite a big believer in that agency people are really, really good, a really, really good fit for those jobs, because they have not just experience of working with lots of different companies, but have probably seen most of the things that they're going to be asked to do. They would have seen how to create, or been involved in creating an EVP. They'll have been involved in creating an employer brand strategy. They'll understand social media. They'll understand a career site, and they'll understand how to take a good brief to put together a tactical campaign for customer services people in Poland. And that's really, really powerful. But I think when you then look at what does an employer brand team need to be able to execute any of that, it comes back to both, I think, a combination of tools and the expectations that go with those tools as well. So, I mentioned before about budgets, for example, but employer brand notoriously does not get great big budgets. There are a few exceptions out there, but by and large, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. In fact, it seems to be getting. There isn't a huge amount of investment in the actual kind of the real execution of an employer brand. You don't see, you don't feel as many of those campaigns anymore. And actually, if we're talking about employer brand having a fundamental impact on the success of an organization, then why not give it a grown-up budget? Why not give it also the measurement tools that you would expect from a marketing team, for example? Why not give it, internally the skilled resource that you need to execute? And by that, particularly, I mean sort of creatively and and digitally. There's always a danger of, I say a danger, like it's a reality. The value of employer brand gets underplayed. And actually, teams need the resources, both financial and skilled, to be able to deliver well. And without it, you do then, it's sort of very, very easy to go back towards that trap of, well, we've done something, but it's not quite going to execute the way that we want, the way that we want it to. We don't quite understand how well that it's going to work. And I think until employer brand gets and earns the recognition, that it deserves, that's always going to be a struggle. And there are times when it does happen. And I do come back to, the armed forces, because it's an easy and obvious place to go. But how well the British Army do at hiring people is reported in the national papers. It's important. There is really good measurement that that they have in place to do that. How well a professional services organization does in recruiting graduate consultants is only really known internally. And I think I would love us as an industry to be able to step back up. I always felt there was a moment in time where we were getting close to that understanding of the value that was brought from employer brand, the impact that had on a business. And there are things that have got in the way of that, budget being one, COVID, unfortunately, probably being part of that as well. And I think there's another piece in there, which actually doesn't kind of talks about a lot, but loyalty. Loyalty of organizations to its people. Talking about sort of like growing up in different environments, but I went like how my parents perceived work was you joined an organization and you'd probably stay there for most of your career. You might work for 2 organizations, but they signed up to this idea of turn up on time, work really hard, and you will be rewarded, and stick at it. And what you got back in return was that loyalty, and not always, but by and large through thick and thin. And that has also flipped round. The loyal companies to their employees, there are some that are really good at it, but I think, if you look at the tech sector, because it's an easy one to do, the answer is not very. But in return, how loyal are employees to their companies? But this is all in the sphere of employer brand, but also the impact that it can has. And back to reputation, if you're an organization that lays off thousands of people every year, it's going to take quite a lot to undo that reputation, undo that uncertainty, because it sticks, because people will look at your organization and also kind of the wider industry and say, well, am I taking a bit of a gamble here? Trust is everything. We live in such a transparent world because of social media, but also, right now, probably everybody is looking over their shoulders and saying, what's AI going to do to my organization? Is AI going to be an opportunity for my organization to save some headcount? Because that there are enough stories of that out there already. I'm probably read 2 articles in the last week of people having pretty good jobs in the creative space, and have been pushed out by AI. And this thing about loyalty is there. Yes, organizations want to be commercially successful, but is it commercially successful at all costs? Is it commercially successful at the cost of your reputation as somewhere to work? What's the right answer to that question?
So actually, okay, so we're going to this thing around what do employer branding teams or employer brand or like solo artists need to do, is having those conversations with people in an organization. How do they show that employer branding is so much more than just attracting people? That thing about, is it having conversations where actually do they need to be positioning themselves with parts of the business and influencers who are about ensuring that there is, people are being engaged in the right way? Is it about getting to the top table and having those kind of business-minded, commercially minded conversations? What should people be doing if they have employer branding in their title or in their team to make sure they are shifting employer branding to the importance we know it is and should be?
I think this comes back to, you sort of mentioned it in your question about employer brand being about attraction, and the shift that's happened and still happening is around sort of inside out employer brands, or creating an inside out EVP, which makes perfect sense. And I'd probably argue has largely existed anyway, because, like anyone who's sort of been in and around this industry for a while, will understand that you can tell the greatest story externally, but if it's not true internally, then it's actually not doing its job. But you want people to, you want to convert the candidate into an employee, and you want that employee to turn up on day one and say, "Oh wow, yeah, this is what I expected it was going to be like." It is everything you told me about the way it was going to feel and what's going to be important and what I need to bring and what I get in return. Yeah, sort of the classic, the give and the get.
Yeah.
That feels real. I've made a good decision. That sounded attractive. That's what it feels like here. I've made a good decision. That's what we're trying to do. I think there's then a question of, but then what happens to the EVP internally, and how far does that project across the rest of your HR, people comms, people and culture teams? Because it should continue, and yes, okay, we're not using it to attract, but we can now use it to reinforce. And typically, find me an EVP that doesn't perhaps talk about career progression in some form or another, whether it's the training and development you get, whether it's the experience that you gain by working on particular projects or with certain people. But there are those, proof points, if you like, which still exist. So the opportunity for the EVP to be able to wrap around those communications, whether that is around sort of more individual communication. Let's not forget, you make an individual decision just about, some of the people you talk to, you make a very personal decision to join a company. And then what happens to you can sometimes feel more of a team. It sometimes feel more of what happens to a team with a little bit of what happens to an individual. But actually, the EVP can be a device that just keeps the fire going under those original connections that you made. And it's about how a company communicates around performance, where it's about how it communicates about benefits. There's still an opportunity there for an EVP to come to life. And there's so much data that exists now as well, to be able to say to organizations, this is where we have issues. Most companies that run employee surveys, they will have data on how long people think they're going to stay at the company for. They can future predict workforce changes, to get an understanding of people's projected tenure and why. And it gives them all sorts of really, really interesting and useful data to say, okay, people think they're going to stay for 2 years. Why are they going to stay for 2 years? What is it that's missing? And then, find the answers to that question and do something about it, which of course comes back to this point of reputation. But the EVP again can be the vehicle that helps to deliver that, deliver that consistent journey. And I think that's where you move from really employer brand to employee experience. I think there's huge opportunity.
It's kind of, when you say that, what comes to mind is employer brand being a painkiller rather than a vitamin. I've heard that kind of, not in employer brand in terms of saying, well, you need to try and be, if you're trying to sell something, be a painkiller, not vitamin. But I think there is that thing about EVP. So employer branding as the category being a great way of solving a number of challenges within an organization. I remember an example where, I was working on a piece of work 2 years ago, and this part of an organization had this, they wanted to recruit, but actually it transpired that one of their frustrations were that people didn't really know what they did.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing some amazing work. So I was like, well, brilliant. Let's use this as an opportunity to raise your profile within the organization so that the teams you work with actually have a better understanding of what you do. And that kind of supercharged things, because I was like, oh, wow, it's not just about getting people in, it's about raising our team and our own personal profiles in the organization. So, yeah, I'm definitely with you on that. I think it's the more you can, not saying it's easy, yeah, but it's the more you can go, look, what we do actually can fix these problems, aka being the heart and soul of an organization, to be totally honest. I think that's fair enough to say, is a nice way of doing it.
I totally agree, and sort of going back to this consumer comparison, that if there are perceptions about a product, then an organization will move to fix that. Absolutely, especially if there's misconceptions, about a product, they will very actively move to try and quell those, to try and bust those misconceptions. And there's no reason why employer brands can't do the same. The hard bit is, as ever, is being able to, internally sort of like grasp what is going on and say, right, okay, this is where we've got a problem. This is what we're going to do to fix it. And now we need to tell everybody about it. So, if you were a hypothetical situation, but if you manufactured mobile phones and your mobile phone had really, really poor battery life, then you would go and you'd be like, okay, people love the operating system, but the battery life is terrible, which kind of makes it unusable. Then you'd go and fix that problem. And then the next model that you'd launched, you would make a big thing about the battery life and say, right, we go back to Nokia 3210. It lasts for 4 days. But you would do something to you would actively do something to solve, not just solve the problem, but show that the problem was solved and win back the customer. And employer brand doesn't do that enough.
It's true, actually, and I think with AI now starting to take root in organizations, and hoping that kind of, I like your example there of operating systems updating on mobile phones. The next model then gets upgraded and improved. I think the more that technology is there to help, the more hopefully that happens, where it is kind of iteration. I think there is a thing around actually making sure that in-house teams have more capability to do things themselves, so they can do those optimizations themselves over time, but then choose partners at the right moment, like agencies, to come and fix certain things. Because otherwise you get is it a classic thing? Build a career site, busy. Career site's done. Thank goodness. Let's do that later on, so that content optimization piece is important.
The EVP has to be organic and has to be iterative. I think because the pace at which organizations change now is just huge, and it's only going to get quicker. And that's not to say that an EVP completely changes, but I think, yes, while it probably maintains a certain DNA, as organizations grow, change, pivot, transform, scale up, scale down, then the EVP actually needs to reflect that. And if you're still talking about the same thing that you were a year ago or 18 months ago, it should be actually a bit out of date, just by the very nature of the company doing exactly the same thing it did 18 months ago. Probably not, especially not right now, because of the pace of change. And that is that is something that actually you can activate on quickly. It doesn't mean you need to rip up the rule work. It just means you Maybe there's more things that maybe there's something new that you've got to put in. Maybe there's something you've got to take out. Maybe there's a new set of content that you need to create to tell that part of the story. So it's, there's a lot of opportunity for everybody with that.
Cheers, Nick. Appreciate it. It's been a good chat. We could have talked for much longer, but anyone who's interested in actually getting some additional conversation that me and Nick had, pop to a shorter episode somewhere near this video or this podcast episode, and you get to hear about our take on the future role of employer branding, employer marketing agencies. But yeah, Nick, really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. Really enjoyed it.